Thank you very much for inviting me here. You may regret having invited me here in 20 minutes or 15 when I lose my voice. I apologize. I may lose my voice. Yes, so 3 models. I'm going to criticize these 3 models and then propose this other 4th model for language evolution. The first model I'm going to analyze and criticize is model number 1, a very popular model, language as the result of adaptation and natural selection. I think there are major problems with this model anywhere, and this is the book that has just been shown, first edition 2010, and then in 2011 we have a reply to our many and bitter critics. You may not believe a word we say in this book, but I think you should believe some very distinguished biologists, some of the very best biologists in the field that say basically what we say. This is Greg Gibson, very distinguished geneticist, says that in a review published in Science in 2005 of a very nice book by Andreas Wagner, Robustness and Evolvability in Living Systems, he says, this book contributes significantly to the emerging view that natural selection is just one and maybe not even the most fundamental source of biological order. Another, Lynch, biochemist, biologist, Indiana University, 2007, it is impossible to understand evolution purely in terms of natural selection, and many aspects of genomic, cellular, and developmental evolution can only be understood by invoking a negligible level of adaptive involvement. Another testimony by Eugene Koonin. Evolutionary genomic studies show that natural selection is only one of the forces that shape genome evolution and is not quantitatively dominant, whereas non-adaptive processes are much more prominent than previously suspected. I could go on. There are a number of other biologists that say this. But for the sake of the argument, let's ignore this. Okay? Imagine that indeed natural selection is the source of all biological traits and behaviors. I'm going to show you, even for the sake of the arguments granting that it cannot have been the case for language evolution. What are the most popular candidates in this approach? Well, motor control, communication, thought and conceptualization. These are the most popular candidates. Well, motor control, I think there is really very little plausibility to this. I'm just giving the most extreme case of a human being that has hardly any motor control. This is CF, a case that was examined by Giuseppe Cossu in Parma several years ago, and he has published this case. And he seen this boy when he was 13 years old. He's now in his early 30s. So this boy can only make 2 voluntary movements, which is eye movements and a movement with his neck like this. The only 2 movements he can make. He has to be strapped to a wheelchair, has been strapped to a wheelchair all his life. But his understanding of language was shown to be absolutely perfect. Moreover, they have created this nice contraption. So by this only movement that he can do, which is twisting his head to the right, he can select letters, and he can select words, and he can write. And I have read 2 or 3 pages of his dissertation at the University of Bologna in philosophy. He's a doctor in philosophy now, on the Bauhaus, the philosophy of the Bauhaus. You would never, ever imagine, you read those pages, you would never imagine that this is the author of those pages. So this is clear evidence against the very old suggestion that goes at least back to Jean Piaget and before, that language is an abstraction of motor control. There is no motor control here, no trial and error, and it cannot be the application of complex coordinated actions over time, fine-grained sequential behavior, and against the thesis that is some kind of skill, motor skill, that language is out of motor skill. If this single case hasn't impressed you, well, then you have deaf signers, brain damaged deaf signers, So you have left hemisphere damaged deaf signers, aphasics, show normal visual and spatial cognition outside the use of specialized syntax of American Sign Language, and right hemisphere damaged non-aphasic signers display impaired visual and spatial cognition, but their language, their sign language is absolutely perfect. You have the references here. So we have a double dissociation. Deficits in the apprehension of linguistic gesture do not transfer to the realm of non-linguistic gesture, communicative or not, and deficits in visual and spatial cognition do not transfer to the realm of the use of space for grammatical purpose. Number of further cases, Laura Petito shown for the acquisition of personal pronouns in American Sign Language, babbling in American Sign Language from congenitally deaf children. So motor control is not needed, and even when it's fully present, cannot transfer to the realm of grammar, cannot transfer from the realm of grammar. What are the other darling candidates in this adaptationist approach? Well, communicability and thinking. So what we are going to see now is really some cases, just some cases, that whenever communicability and syntax compete, or whenever thought and syntax compete, syntax always wins and wins hands down. This is a very small selection of cases I'm going to present for reasons of time, but the real complete evidence is some 50 years and some 2,000 researchers in generative grammar, 100 languages and dialects examined, and also not just generative grammar. You have basically the same approach in lexical functional grammar, generalized phrase structure grammar, head-driven phrase structure grammar, which are sort of different schools than generative grammar. Not one case in all these decades of study, not one case in syntax has been solved by invoking communication or ease of communication. But let me show you that where you would expect it to work most, communication to dominate language, it doesn't. It's the other way, is syntax. So, ellipsis. You have part of a sentence that is not pronounced, is not omitted, is communicatively very expedient, less words, less efforts. Is considered redundant, something like, John should bring his maracas and Luigi should too. You don't say again, bring his maracas. Okay? You won't believe Peter, but you will Bob. And this challenges the idea that all you have is an economy of words, that you can omit a bunch of words. You cannot omit a bunch of words. You can only omit complete constituents. The only thing that can be omitted and deleted is something that must be recoverable, is something that is a complete constituent, complete syntactic constituents. So you can only omit a syntactic structure as a whole, not just a bunch of words. Moreover, in these cases, you can add things. So you would say, okay, I have omitted a number of words. Well, some of these words I'm going to bring them back. No, you can't do that. You cannot bring back those words. So John knows that Mary bought a book, but Fred doesn't. It's perfect. John knows that Mary bought a book, but Fred doesn't know that Mary is completely off. John wants to become a pilot, but his father doesn't. It's very clear. His father doesn't want to become a pilot. But then you add something, okay? You add explicit what is being a lie, that John wants to become a pilot, but his father doesn't want that. Now you have ambiguity. It can be that his father doesn't want himself to become a pilot, or you can interpret he doesn't want John to become a pilot. You can translate it into French, you can translate it into Italian, I don't know about Japanese, you have exactly the same thing. You add this, and something that wasn't ambiguous becomes ambiguous. So it's not just economy of communication. So adding words disrupts the syntax or creates ambiguity where there was none. So the elided structure is always understood to be there as a whole. And it has predictable causal manifestations. I'm not going to project the case assignment. There are examples, for instance, in German or in Russian, when something that is not there assigns case. So you have the first part has accusative case, a verb that assigns the accusative, you omit it, and then what is remained there, the who or the what, has accusative case. If the verb assigns dative, you have dative case. So if something that isn't there assigns case. Okay. Now, another example where you expect more, code switching, inserting fragments from one language in your discourse in another language. It has been studied extensively. And what you have there is that you cannot insert anything wherever you want. The central consideration is that although the motivation is quintessentially communication or communicative, well, you have to respect the syntax. You can only insert whatever is tolerated by, allowed by the syntax of the main language. You cannot insert, something that the syntax doesn't allow. You have strict syntactic constraints on what is possible. So code switching is rule government, is syntax government. These motivations cannot overcome syntax. In fact, nothing can overcome syntax. And syntax is autonomous with respect to motivation and social functions. So, for instance, you cannot have a switching between an NP, a noun phrase, and a modifier, an adjective, between a negation and the verb, between a verb and its auxiliary. There are plenty of things you cannot do in code switching. So there is no escape from syntax. Codes are switches only at points where the surface structures and the deep structures also of the two languages map onto one another. So the lesson from all this is, a number of other cases, but there is no escape from syntax. Conversational strategies, communicative intention, pragmatic requirements must bow to syntax. So communication cannot have been the selective factor. Motor control cannot be communication. What about thought, general, for the way we think? What about general schemata we apply to our understanding of what happens? Is this the source? Well, no, it doesn't seem to be. Because, look, there is a language universal which is called the verb-object constraint. The verb-object constraint is the following, is that a verb merges, unites with its object before it unites with the agent. Now, if you conceive of actions, we all, in the general conception of actions, the agent of the action is associated with the actions more intimately than the action is associated with its object, but not in syntax. In syntax, the situation is different. Mark Baker has examined this. He has a number of cases. It is really a language universal. It doesn't depend on the order, VSO, SVO, and so on and so forth. Easy to write formal languages where this doesn't happen, as the opposite happens. And from a purely conceptual point of view, the agent conceptually is associated with the action more intimately than the action is associated with its object. So you have a number of cases. For instance, in Mohawk, or in this Australian language, you have something like the baby meat ate. You combine the meat and the verb. You cannot have baby ate. You cannot combine the subject baby ate and then the meat. In other languages, you have something like bread cut with a knife. You can put together bread and cut, or you can put together knife cut. But you cannot have, he cut bread with a knife. And you have idioms in all languages. All the idioms in all languages, they have the verb and the object. And the subject is free to be whatever it is. You don't have idiom in which you have the subject and the verb and the object is whatever it is. There are very few cases where it seems to be like that, but you analyze them better, it's not like that. Then, this is another interesting thing, number of works, 4 volumes now on what is called the left periphery, which is, the syntactic structure. If you look at the sentence, it's the top of the sentence towards your left. You have, I won't go into the details of this, you have all this very complicated hierarchy. So not all sentences have all this, but when a sentence has a number of these, that's the way the hierarchy works. So, for instance, I have an example in Italian, an example in English. He used to be inclined to want to stop. It's okay. He used to be inclined to want to stop. He was inclined to use to want to stop. It's completely out. So, a number of data that confirm this hierarchy. You have had movement, restriction, verbs, clitic climbing, and so on and so forth. There are a number of data in many, many languages. Now, what is so curious about this? For instance, habitual dominates volitional. Isn't that strange that habitual dominates volitional? That irrealis dominates alethic, logical necessity, possibility, or impossibility, and so on, and so on, and so on. Okay? So thought This is not the way we think. It is the way we speak, but it's not the way we think in the abstract. It's very bizarre, this dominance relation. So we could have no hierarchy, and we could have a different hierarchy. We could communicate equally well. Now, let me give you another, I think, very interesting, quite damaging to the idea that thought is what inspires language, is the conservativity of determiners. A lot of work on the conservativity of determiners. I am in a very good company in having inquired about this. So what is the conservativity of determiners? Well, the arguments of natural language determiners, they have to be ordered, okay? So you have a specific order. So the Tuscans are Italians, it's true. What is not true is that the Italians are Tuscans, so you cannot invert the arguments of a determiner like the, or determinants like most, all, and so on and so forth. They have to have that order. So very simple example. All men are mortal, man, is the same as saying all men are mortal is the same as saying all men are mortal men. And Jim Higginbotham tells me that this is already found in William of Sherwood. All children like ice cream is the same as saying all children are ice cream lovers that are children. Most Basques are Spaniards is the same as saying most Basques are Basque Spaniards, and so on and so forth. So you have scope and restriction, and one is the restriction, the other is the scope. And the general relation between sets that you have, a conservative relation, you have a relation with set A and set B, and this is the same, if it is a conservative relation, is exactly the same as the relation between this set and the intersection of the two sets. Okay? All Tuscans are Italian, all Tuscans are Tuscan Italians. Now, we can invent non-conservative determiners. This is one example I do to Juan Uriaguereca. Imagine, troll sharks eat fish. It would be the same thing as saying troll fish are fish that sharks eat. Instead of all sharks eat fish is the same as all sharks are sharks that eat fish. This impossible determiner would be non-conservative. We can think like this with paper and pencil. We can create imaginary determinants in any way we want. They are non-conservative determinants. No child will learn it. No language you find such determinants. So they are very easy for thought. Okay? So non-conservative relations are ubiquitous. Even in games, for instance, very simply, the relation of A trumps B. You have this relation of 4 of a kind, trump full house. Then you take the intersection, and you have this relation, which is also true, but is not the same relation. So you have something which is asymmetric, transitive, but not conservative. Just a simple case of something which is asymmetric, transitive, not conservative. So how frequent are conservative relations between sets? Well, the calculation has been done by Keenan and Stavy. You have about 8 in 1,000. So the percentage of conservative relations between sets is less than 1%. But this is a language universal, although this is a very rare kind of relation between sets. All determinants of all languages have this relation, which is in the order of abstract possibilities less than 1%. So we have a universal, which concern a key relation between sets. The most elementary thing you can see, sets and relation between sets. How can something be more elementary in thought than sets and relation between sets? And what all languages have taken for all their determiners is something which is less than 1% of all conceivable relation between sets. Okay? Is it too hard for thought? No, it's not too hard for thought. I just gave you an example. I can give you 25 other examples. You can easily think about non-conservative determiners. It takes a little bit of paper and pencil, but it's something we can think about without any problem. They would be unlearnable by the child, not because the child is stupid, but because the child is a human being, and they can only learn something which is in the domain of natural languages for humans. You have no way of explaining this, I assure you, with logical, standard predicate argument laws of thought, psychology of reasoning, even less so, pragmatic constraints, communication, cultural habits, and this sort of thing. There is no hope you can explain this universal of language. And I won't go into the detail. There is an explanation in syntax. There are various factors that have been examined, and these are exquisitely syntactic factors that explain that. So, none of the selective pressures for the evolution of language as an adaptation we have seen, communication, motor control, culture, and so on and so forth, can begin to explain the core of language. Well, model number 2. Okay, forget communication, forget pure thought. We have other cognitive things. So what is a critique of this? All double dissociations between language and cognition, of which there are many. Okay? So let me just give you a few of these. The famous case, Susan Curtis has studied, and then she has recently written summaries about this. So Jeannie, this poor girl who was, kept sequestered, for a year until she was, 9 years old. Excellent vocabulary learning, good ability to initiate and sustain topics, excellent ability to apprehend complex hierarchical structures outside the realm of grammar, good ability to logically sequence pictures, and so on and so forth, bafflingly powerful non-verbal communicative ability, superior visual and spatial cognition, but severely limited grammar, lacked functional structure, all the INC system functional elements completely absent, and then cannot have this fundamental syntactic operation called move. Many more cases. Women, girls with Turner syndrome, they only have one X chromosome. They have pervasive non-language perceptual and cognitive deficits, studied by Susan Curtis, Yamada, and others. And the mirror image is boys with Klinefelter syndrome, a XXY chromosome, normal conversational abilities, several specific language disorders, for instance, binding and control, presupposition and entailment, object class. Double dissociation. A number of others double dissociation cases, a number of them. So, you also have a neural distinctiveness, distinct columns of neurons or neural tissues in the cortex. You may have heard this already in this thing. Different from those that respond to acoustic distinctions. And then you can have manipulation that have acoustic signals, that the outlier is distinct acoustically, or it may not be phonological. You have an outlier which is an outlier phonologically, but not acoustically, so you have a dissociation even between sounds and phonology. How soon does it happen? Very soon. It happens very soon. 3-month-old, have been tested, and these specificity of the different sensitivity of different brain areas are present, before the onset of speech production. How fast is this? It's very fast. The discrimination is very fast. The early time window is very narrow and robustly present, of an index of automatic syntactic processing. So it's a modular response. So summing up, the modularity of language makes no doubt. The micromodularity of language, modules inside the language, I think that Stefano Cappa may have already, given the election that, the modularity inside language also makes no doubt. It cannot be the case that language is an application of general intelligence, that cognitive structure percolate, transfer, migrate, apply to language. Okay, model number 3, learnability and statistics. Here I can only give you the flavor of this because it immediately becomes quite technical. The idea, for instance, we have selected 2 of these cases, the Reali and Christensen, 2003 and 2005. The idea that you have bigrams, pairs of words, the statistics of pairs of words that can explain a number of syntactic phenomena by pure statistics. And another paper that has made a lot of splash, Perforce, Tannenbaum, and Regiers, domain general capacities, Bayesian analysis, and they claim that all the child needs to learn syntax is this domain general capacity without having, quote unquote, without having this knowledge innately specified as part of the language faculty. Now, here are 3 papers, one of which I'm a co-author, that have analyzed this in detail. All the statistics have also analyzed computer programs that are the kind of computer program that these authors have suggested, and it doesn't work. It really, their thing doesn't work. When you do it, it's really out. So the punchline of this critique is that low-level statistics over word strings may be of some use, but cannot substitute for syntactic knowledge. Then the only route, and it has been shown with computer simulation, is that you have local syntactic dependencies, that you have dependencies over phrase structures which do not have a physical manifestation or an acoustic manifestation. And at a minimum, the child must have this accessible to explain how the child can get to the syntax the way it gets, as it was proposed many, many years ago. Okay, so these models don't work. What now? Well, what do we have in mind? What do we suggest, rather? Probably minor modifications in gene regulation, not driven by functional demands for the reason I have just explained, not the result of adaptation and natural selection, and then modifications in one or more developmental modules with an impact on brain structure and function. Now, are we appealing to miracles? This is the usual critique. Okay, well, you're appealing miracles. No, we are not appealing to miracles, and let me show you a case as a representative case. What would you say about the following? Perfectly formed globular eyes, capable in the abstract of forming detailed images, no brain to receive these images, no optic nerve, and the focal distance of the lens that goes behind the retina. Okay? And then you have other details that make these globular eyes, very similar to what we have in vertebrates. A lot of structure without any function. And this is the creature that has, these are called rhopalia. You see them here, 4 rhopalia, each containing 4 globular eyes with no brain, nothing to form images. They are sensitive to light and to darkness, but hundreds of other species of jellyfish have much, much more rudimental organs. So you have all this structure without function. Is this mysterious? It's not so mysterious. It's it's a perfect case of Evo-Divo. Cedric yesterday presented rightly this Evo-Divo. So this is what you have. You have a perfect, globular eyes. You have eyes at 90 degrees. Very nice. Wouldn't it be nice to have us? We had eyes at 90 degrees. We could see what happens there. But we don't have. They have them, and they have no brain to use them. So considerable conservation of regulatory genes, and so there is a lot of overlap. And this is a story which is a very nice Evo-Divo story. There are no mysteries here. What has happened, I won't go into the detail, but what has happened from it have a duplication of an ancestral gene, and then you have a duplication of the duplication, and the biochemistry and the gene regulation is perfectly well explained by these authors. So it's not mysterious why these creatures have these eyes. You have a genetic explanation, and what is interesting is that there is a lot of genetic, developmental similarity, perhaps even more than similarity, between the eyes, the globular eyes in these creatures and the globular eyes in a mouse, in a giraffe, or in us. They didn't expect this to happen. It was a discovery. They have discovered that. The genetics of the system is not mysterious. The genetics of the system has been explained. So you have the activation of developmental module, you have a duplication of genes, and you have all this structure that has no function, but is there, and is not a miracle, is not mysterious, is very interesting, is curious and interesting, but not miraculous and not inexplicable. So the lessons from this case, I think there are 3 of them. That relatively simple genetic changes explain major morphological changes in novelty, high conservation of the gene complexes and the gene regulatory system, changes not driven by function, changes not driven by adaptiveness, though of course they are compatible. These creatures can survive very well with all these eyes. They are not very useful, but they can survive and reproduce. The modularity. of genes and development, and also that once you activate a module, there are other examples. Cedric has shown other examples, insects, all these complicated horns of insects. Once you activate a developmental module, it may well go all the way up, not stop in between. And this is regardless of utility. Okay? So very ancient dormant genes can be duplicated and then activated, of which there's a number of examples in the Evo-Devo literature. You know, my friend Alessandro Minelli has published it, you know, and other authors as well, you know. So, what now? Certainly crucial steps in the evolution of language at the very minimum have been the lexicon, unlimited recursion, the binary branching and X-bar structure, syntactic movement, internal merge, and the interaction with the interfaces. Now, yesterday I have shown, I think I have, make it plausible, that these two come from physics. You don't have to have an evolutionary adaptive story because they come from physics. Once you have a system capable of doing this, why you have this X-bar structure, why you have binary branching, is principles of optimal computation. Well, what about the lexicon? Look, the lexicon, you know, we have heard this morning about symbols. Well, words are symbols in a sense, but they are so special symbols because unlike any other symbols, they must possess at the very least these four characteristics: a spectral reference, headedness, internal structure, and edge features. So very briefly, a spectral reference, you know, it is something that, you know, buy and sell. Whenever you have an act of buying, you have an act of selling, and this is the way we look at it, whether we describe it as buying versus selling. Whenever you have some creature fleeing, you have another creature chasing. You may make a little movie. The movie is the same for buy and sell. The movie is the same between flee and chase, but these are aspects, a spectral reference. And all the words in our language, in every language, all the words in our lexicon have this spectral reference that symbols have not. You know, the cries and the signals, vervet monkeys, you know, making a cry for a leopard, which is different from the cry for a snake, they don't have a spectral reference. And then you have headedness, the head-complement relation, which is conserved throughout the syntactic derivation. You have this headedness that symbols usually don't have. And then you have a lot of internal structure, really a lot. You have all the thematic roles. You have the hierarchy, internal hierarchy. Let me give you some example derived from studies by Anna Maria Di Sciullo. You have this headedness is preserved throughout the derivation, and you have all of these structure, even for something as simple as this, you know, who versus what. Very simple, tiny little words, they have this internal structure. And more internal structure. For more complicated words, you have to have all this internal structure with interesting differences, parametric variation, anyway, differences between different languages and how they can combine. You have an internal hierarchy. Very simple examples I'm taking from Anna Maria. You have valuable, invaluable. You don't have valuable. Okay? So whenever you have something like this, invaluable, it means it's impossible to give value to it. You don't have any word that is, say, possible not to. So inedible means impossible to eat. You don't have possible not to eat. So they are offering, you know, a reception. They don't tell you, oh, we have inedible things for you. It means you can eat them if you want. If you don't want, you cannot eat them. You know, it's a very simple thought. But it cannot be a word because negation dominates everything else. You cannot have negation saying possible not to. A number of other examples. So you have negation dominates modality, and you have different modality. It cannot be the case that modality. So you have enlarged, you have re-enlarged, but you cannot have in-relarged. In French, you have re-largened. You cannot have that. So you have aspect dominates modality, aspect 1 dominates aspect 2, dominates modality, with some interesting difference between the different languages. Possible not to is a very simple concept, an impossible word, an impossible word. And then you have this rather complicated fundamental called edge features. So you have mergeability. You have things that are put together and they have a valency. As in chemistry, you have valency, and this valency percolates all the way up. So you have some detail. I won't go into all these details, but you have operator features that C-command asymmetrically as spectral features, and then you have semantic relations, predicate argument, aspect and operator variable relations between affixes and roots are derived in the morphology and are legible at the interface with the cognitive interpretive thing. Very complicated. This is the lexicon. The lexicon is this. It's not a bunch of symbols. It is a bunch of symbols that have all these properties. And in fact, Mark Hauser, in a volume that Juan Viragareka and I edited, says, quote unquote, there is nothing remotely resembling words in animal communication. And he knows. He's the author of a big volume of some years back on called Animal Communication. There is nothing remotely resembling words in animal communication. They have symbols and cries and things like that, nothing remotely resembling words. Okay, so how did we get all this? How did we get? Well, some event that is much more limited than what we have seen for all the eyes of the jellyfish, of that species of jellyfish. Some minor gene rearrangement, minor shifts in gene regulation that has impacted brain organization, probably only minimally. So why do I call this model 1/2? Because I can't tell you which genes have done what. In the years to come, I'm sure somebody will discover them. The younger people here probably will see that. But at the time, don't ask me because nobody knows about that. So the future will tell us. What if something, like the appearance of the Rhopalia happened in our species? And it did find a function. It did interact with function. It is not like the case of the Rhopalia that had no function, no brain. We have a brain. We have, all the apparatus. So a small mutation like that, has found a very fertile thing to give all these things that we know are part of language. It did find the function, and it did interface with pre-existing structures, conceptual structures, motor structures that were already there. So let me give you one example. I like this example because Steve Wilson is a colleague in my university. This was published a few months ago. It's a very nice example. Let me give, I'm not telling you this is the explanation, but just to give you the flavor of what one discovers. So they have done multimodal imaging approach, the diffusion tensor imaging, voxel-based morphometry, functional MRI, a bunch of these things. Okay, so you have a dorsal and a ventral language pathway linking frontal and temporal language regions, and they have distinct roles. Only the dorsal pathways, I'll show you that in a moment in an image, the SLF and arcuate, plays a critical role in syntactic processing. Only that one plays a critical role in syntactic processing. Syntactic deficits and functional abnormalities related to syntactic processing in primary progressive aphasia. They have studied primary progressive aphasia, which is not traumatic in the sense. It's something that happens over time. They are specialists at the University of Arizona on primary progressive aphasia. It may reflect not only gray matter damage, but also disruption of communication between frontal and temporal language regions, specifically via the dorsal pathway. So you have these different connections between, approximately Broca's and vertices. You have this different thing. And you have different manifestations of lesions, even small lesions, to respectively each one of these. Lesions in these, there are two pathways here in reality, compromise syntax. Lesions here don't compromise syntax, but they compromise other things, number of words that you can remember, this sort of thing. So for instance, here you have 3 different patients. Here you have a non-fluent patient. Here you have a semantic problem with this patient. And here you have a logopenic, very few words. And you see, different configurations of these different connecting things. Now, what is interesting is the following. A recent comparative diffusion tensor imaging study reported that the arcuate branch of the superior longitudinal fascicles, what you have seen in the image, is indeed strongly modified in humans relative to non-human primates. We have found one thing. I'm not telling this is the key, this is all we need, but these kind of studies, of which there will be more and more and more, can give us keys one day to explaining, humans relative to non-human primates. It projects much more densely to posterior temporal cortex than it does in macaques or chimpanzees, especially in the left hemisphere. So, a lesson from Evo Devo and modularity, that it may be quite illuminating also to study distant species, distant from us, in which the same developmental modules have been activated. So songbirds are interesting. There was early in this room an interesting kind of experiments on songbirds. They may be even more interesting than primates, not because we have recent ancestors in common. We do not derive from birds. They are not our close relatives. But something has been activated in songbirds that allows them to have these very complicated songs, to learn songs, to variate the songs. Some species have one song for the rest of their life. Other species have a different song every season. They acquire a different song. So it is a very interesting case. We do not share ancestors with them. And this is Bob Berwick's Big Bang. I like it. There was, you projected a similar slide yesterday. So, birds have rhythm and vocal learning. Chimps are smart creatures. They got categories, And then, these two things may have combined in us for the first time. And so we get both, and we got merged, and we got the lexicon, and we got all that. I'm not telling you, Bob Berwick doesn't claim that's it. Believe us, that's what happened. But it gives us an idea of an approach to language evolution which is different. Activation of a module, activation of another module, and in other species all you have. That module has been activated, and in another species that module has been activated, and then both modules have been activated with a number of interesting consequences. Now, this is a very distinguished evolutionary biologist, Leonard Krugliak, professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at Princeton, so we should listen to him. He knows what he's talking about. Now, this is a paper published in Nature. It is about complex diseases. Because diseases are interesting, you want to treat people, understanding that where the money is. But a complex disease is a complex biological trait. So this refers to complex biological traits. What does Leonard Krugliak say? It is a possibility that there is something we just don't fundamentally understand that is so different from what we are thinking about that we are not thinking about it yet. God bless him. God bless him. And I stop here.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Very impressive. Very impressive. So we have about 15 minutes for discussion. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand and identify yourself. Okay. Yeah, you. No.
I'm Simon Kirby, University of Edinburgh. Thanks very much for this overview of your position in biolinguistics. I wonder if you're setting up a false opposition, because what you're saying is that if we learn these lessons from Evo Devo, perhaps there's a way that some small mutations could give us, activate these new modules that may be connected in certain ways. But I don't see that that's necessarily in contradiction to various of the other positions that you were talking about. For example, the Bayesian models may tell us what those modules might be like. For example, they might allow us to know how domain-specific they need to be, how strongly constraining they need to be, whether they can exist as small biases or strong constraints. The arguments from the position of those people who believe in functionalist approaches, talking about natural selection, they might be perfectly happy to see the source of these novelties come from those kind of processes, but then the target of natural selection for one cause or another. And your arguments about them seem to be about, seems to me as far as I can understand them, about ontogeny rather than about the source of these adaptations. So I wonder if you could see that there might be a rapprochement between a view that talks about the origin of novel structures in the brain through ego processes, and those of us who are trying to understand the consequences of properties of the brain in the evolutionary language.
Well, look, we will need a lot of things to really understand. We need a lot of things. But I don't think it's very interesting to see what is a mathematical model of something we know it is not the case. How do you explain something that we know cannot have been a cause in the evolution of language for all the reasons I'm telling you? I just mentioned some. That is a lot more than I had time to mention. So on the one hand, yes, we will need a lot of things, good mathematical models. There is some component that is statistical, especially in acoustically isolating words. The saffron and others have shown that 8 months old, they take probabilistic cues to understand in the flow of speech what a word is. But then, it doesn't go further than that. So maybe rapprochement, on the one hand, it is important, I think, to realize that the candidates that have been offered so far have no hope of explaining the evolution of language. I think it's important to understand that, and so start afresh, from this evo-devo consideration, from this genetic, start afresh and have good new models, different from the models we have so far. This is what I think.
Anyone else? Okay.
I had a similar comment actually, which was Simon Fisher from Max Planck Institute, which is from the evo-devo framework. I think is an absolutely fantastic way to begin to attack language in a new sense. But I don't see that that's incompatible with functionalist sort of arguments. So, for example, you're talking about this. The RJ fasciculus results the differences between chimpanzees and humans, and one might, I think it's reasonable to assume that genetic changes in developmental genes are responsible for that, and that we might be able to pinpoint which genes were involved. Why is that incompatible with some kind of selectionist argument, natural selection acting on those genes to increase the connectivity of those regions? I mean, whether it was for, the cause of that may be unknown, but why do we have to completely discount any kind of functional argument?
Look, I'm familiar with your work, I admire your work, but look, there is an anecdote. They asked one of the Rockefellers how he had become a billionaire. And he said that, during the Depression, with other kids, we were buying bags of potatoes for 3 cents. And then in the bag of rotten potatoes, you always find good potatoes. So we isolated the good potatoes and we sold them for 5 cents. And so this is the way you became a billionaire. No, my grandfather died and left me $25 million. So I think this is really the story. You have these major events, a new structure is created. And then you have, you do potatoes, natural selection for something that we have to really say what that pressure is being for natural selection, and, refines it. So you have this major change, all of a sudden genetic change and all that. And then the refinement of this, it's an empirical hypothesis. We have to see whether you had further refinement, under which pressure. I don't expect that much to happen, in this thing. I think that really the event is inheriting $25 million for your granddaughter.
Sorry to follow on from that. Now you're talking about major changes, and before you've been saying, well, it's a minor change at the genetic level that's triggering this big change at the phenotype level.
Okay. Minor or major, it can be genetically minor with major physiological consequences and major things.
I understand that. So how do we, as geneticists, how are we going to track down, because if we look in the human genome, we see lots and lots and lots and lots of minor changes and minor differences from, even if we look at the animals. So how are we going to find those?
Look, fair enough. I think we have to know what we are looking for. We are looking for the genetic basis of what? So, for instance, the lexicon. You have to look at the genetic basis for the things we have seen we know are in the lexicon, all the structure. If we don't know what we are looking the genetic correlates of, we won't go very far. And we will need all the resources that we have, to do that.
Can I just, sorry, I just want to finish off with just one point. Can I ask what your position is with regard to Chomsky's saying that variation in the existing population, because one way of finding the genetics would be the variability. There's variability in the existing population in lexical abilities, and one might.
Well, there are aspects of lexicon that are more variable than others. For instance, lexicon, the richness of the lexicon, it has been shown with twins. You're familiar with this thing. Identical twins to non-identical twins. In syntax, there doesn't seem to be that much variation. So you have something which is this, snowflake, and then you have other variations. So part of it is non-variant, and part of it is variant. It will be interesting to study both. Yes.
Jim, please.
This is Jim Herford from the University of Edinburgh. This follows on from the previous question, and I think may address more or less exactly the same issue. You talked about a minor change, and then you said it did find the function. Now, apparently the consequences of this minor change have gone to fixation throughout the whole human population. Why did that happen if there was no natural selection? How is it that this minor change has gone to fixation?
Well, how did the eyes of the jellyfish go to fixation? Not for a functional reason. They have no function. So it happens that you have something, and it goes to fixation, stabilizing. It stabilizes across the population, not because it has a function, but because it gets stabilized. These are mechanisms of stabilization.
So is it purely accidental that language is so useful?
No, it is not accidental because we have it, we happen to have it, and we use it in many ways. But one thing is to say that we have language, and since we have it, we use it the way we use. That the use is what piloted the evolution of language. It's a very different thesis. Of course, I'm entirely in favor of the first. Since we have it, we use it in many ways. We have organized all our life, as a consequence of that. And I'm in favor of that. It's a fact. But that function has what been driving the evolution of language that I don't see. I haven't seen a function that has been, invoked that has implausibility of having that. As to fixation, yes, it got fixated. A number of other things have got fixated in our species that don't have particular function, like, the hair and this sort of thing. They also got fixated, not because they are particularly useful.
So I stop here. I see well. Not bad.
Rafael Núñez, Cognitive Science, University of California, San Diego. So beyond the problem of modules, which is a theoretical issue rather than an empirical one, my question involves the essentially a question of what do you see in these genetic changes happening? We know today, for example, that there's cultural activity that changed the genome, let's say lactose tolerance, for example. So do you see the major changes that you're invoking in the genetics driven culturally, like the lactose tolerance, for example, issue, or purely driven by the modules that you have invoked, nothing to do with cultures whatsoever?
Well, I think that culture and selective pressures for culture came once we had this apparatus, and then they transformed things. I know, of course, lactose tolerance is a very fine case. Do we have reasons to believe that they all died, except those that has lactose tolerance? This is one thing. Another thing is, since you have this lactose intolerance or lactose tolerance, then you have goats and you drink milk all your life, or you don't drink milk all your life. You adapt, given the genetic apparatus that you have, you reasonably adapt your culture and your life, depending on the genes you have. I see it sort of the other way around.
I'm here.
I'm Evolang from Northeastern University. I'm not sure I understand what you mean when you say that the photoreceptors in jellyfish have no function. And again...
No. Photoreceptors have a function. It's this, all these globular eyes that are doing nothing better in that species than very simple photoreceptor that other species have.
Okay, but then I agree with the previous question. The genetic mechanism tells us how, by chance, they got this very sophisticated apparatus. But then this is, as I see, a photoreceptor that by chance is more sophisticated. But they got fixated because had a selective advantage as compared to those who lacked any
No, it does. I'm sorry, it doesn't. The other 600 species or so of jellyfish have rather primitive, efficient, but rather primitive photoreceptors. These creatures do not do anything better than those other creatures do with all these apparatus. They do what the other creatures do. They are sensitive to light and to darkness, just like the other species that have a different physiology, different embryology of those simple photoreceptors. Of course, they survive. They survive very well with all these eyes. They don't die because they have all these eyes. But the appearance of these eyes is not something that has been selected by their function. It's compatible with survival and reproduction. Yes.
Yeah, no, I'm puzzled by saying with certainty that they do not do anything better than the other receptors. It's a statement I cannot understand how it can be true.
Look, they do not form images because
no brain.
No, not only because there is no brain, but because the retina is too close to the lens for it to form images. So they do not form images. They have no brain to, even if they did form images, they have no brain and no, nerve cord to vehiculate those images. So they are sensitive, like all these other hundreds of species. They are sensitive to intense light and obscurity, like these other species, exactly like those other species.
Okay. So this is going to the last one, please.
Gary Lucan from University of Wisconsin-Madison. The sentence, John wants to become a pilot, but his father doesn't, is ambiguous to me. As an English speaker, it is ambiguous, and even though it may map to a formally unambiguous structure, it is semantically ambiguous, and I believe your statement saying that syntax wins ignores the last 20 years of psycholinguistics. But what I really wanted to ask is, you a few minutes ago said that we need to find out the genetic basis of what we know is there. I don't think we know that all of these formal structures are there. I really think that the fact that statistical learning and Bayesian models and connectionist models work tells us that...
Do they? I don't think they do. I really don't think they do. We disagree sharply about that. Don't give me as an assumption that they do work because they don't.
Well, it's an assumption. I believe the assumption here is that what the child is doing is acquiring a formal grammar. And to paraphrase my colleague Mark Seidenberg, the child doesn't have as a goal to acquire grammar. The child's goal is to understand and be understood. And if all of these other things are good enough, right, they're not good enough to get you to the formal grammar, but they're good enough to communicate. Maybe we don't need the formal grammar. You're correct, and the generative grammar program is entirely correct in saying that many of these, perhaps all of these formal structures are not learnable, and so the poverty of the stimulus holds. But maybe they don't need to be learned, and maybe it speaks to the intelligence and creativity of the field that these structures have been posited. But all the evidence is internal. It comes from within rather than, it's an assumption that this sentence, John wants to become pilot, his father doesn't, is unambiguous. If you test people, you will find that it is in fact ambiguous. People disagree, and it's subject to, for instance, semantic effects. If you replace father with brother, you would get people making different inferences from this statement.
So, well, I'm not a native speaker of English. I swear that in Italian the equivalent is absolutely unambiguous. It sounds to me that, John wants to be a pilot, but his father doesn't. I don't interpret it as meaning that his father doesn't want him, Peter, whatever, to become a pilot. But if his father doesn't want that, then it becomes ambiguous. It's certainly the case in Italian and French. I think it's the case in England too. But what was the purpose of that? The purpose was that you add things, and something that wasn't, or only minimally, ambiguous becomes genuinely ambiguous by adding material. Okay, and it's not mysterious. Gennaro Cherchi has studied these cases in detail, so we know we have an explanation of why it's so. It's not mysterious. It has nothing to do with communication and the efficiency of communication.
But it is. I entirely agree that it's a fascinating phenomenon, but it's also possible that adding things makes it ambiguous because we're constantly making inferences, pragmatic inferences about why would a person say this? What are they trying to communicate? And it, rather than the answer lying entirely in the formal syntactic structure of the sentence.
Well, look, of course, there is a pragmatics of me making inference, all that. But the point is that when you have a clash between syntactic structure and the semantics you derive from the syntactic structure and the pragmatic requirements, is the syntactic structure that wins whenever you have. Usually they go together. When they don't, syntax wins.
Sorry, but Councillor Ganoe here wants to say a single word. Single word.
Okay, so in single word, can you back 2 slides? Some words.
This?
Okay.
Okay.
Can you tell me how you can merge out of vocal learning and categories?
If I knew, I would get the Nobel Prize. I can't give you the details. The suggestion is that something that you find in one, you are an expert about songbirds, I heard your talk, something that you find well developed in a species, and then you have something else which is well developed in a different species, since you, okay, I can't give you the details, I wish I could.
Okay, thank you very much.